Our next speaker is Lorraine Smith, and she's going to tell us about trees, I believe. She'll tell us about a lot of other things, too. I met Lorraine because I read an article she wrote on her website. And I thought, hey, this is a kindred spirit. And she grew up in Brazil, and she also has figured out how to merge or balance or work within the business community on going beyond sustainability to what is more urgent, as we all know. So,
thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to check, is the sound all right? You're hearing me? Okay, and some visuals will appear magically in the background as well. And as that's happening, I'll just offer a couple moments of context about why I'm here. Even before I do that, thank you, Adam and Paula and the organizers and everybody who's here on a weekend to think about how we can better understand nature in relation to a resilient future in the face of climate change. It's no small thing. And I have the pleasure of joining many convergences. I get to stand here from time to time and also sit where you are and listen. I've got to say, this is a really unique convergence, and that actually gives me more hope than anything else. This you could say this is the choir. You know, you're here because I think you want to talk about climate, but it's a different kind of choir, and that gives me a lot of hope. While my slides are coming up, I'll also just offer a little bit more context about what I'm about to do, so I can quickly pop through the slides. I spent a year in Brazil as a youth. I actually grew up in Toronto. I've already said something that rhymes with out, so I've outed myself as a Canadian. And I've had the pleasure of spending places in a few parts of the world, and that's some of what I'll touch on. So I'm going to touch on 3 separate pieces of information, but I hope they interrelate and connect to the broader theme of listening to nature. And firstly, I'll just set the stage a little bit, a sort of once upon a time, who am I and what puts me on this stage. And as Adam mentioned, I work with business. That's sort of how I keep the lights on, as it were. But I'm a bit of a germ, or maybe a spore, within the business community, because I think it's quite important that business be a force for good. And I heard, and how many of you were here yesterday, actually? So quite a few. And I think you probably hear in your day-to-day some of the very real concerns with which I share about the role of industry in our future. So nonetheless, I spend most of my time inside of large, often global corporations. And I do that in good faith, and I believe in what I do. So I'd like to share a little bit more about what that means. And in the middle of all this, I'll, thank you, can I start advancing now? Yes, very good. In the middle of all this, thank you very much, John, I will just share an anecdote from a book that I'm mostly done and in the process of bringing out to the world. And it's sort of the moment where the penny really dropped for me about what trees have been trying to tell me for a long time. So I'll share a brief excerpt of one of the chapters of my book. It'll be the first time it's shared with an audience. So I'm very excited about that. I'm a little bit nervous, and I certainly welcome your feedback. And then I'll veer back into, so what does that have to do with my day job, and how am I spending that penny that really dropped? Actually, it was sort of a bunch of pennies hitting me on the head. And so that's what we'll talk about. And I also just want to say, audience-wise, it's such a pleasure to be in the audience where I was one of 3 people knitting. So shout out to the other knitters. I'm a knitter and a spinner and a weaver, and I firmly believe that it's been integrating with those very real pieces of our everyday lives that's been a great gift for me, and learning from folks with a lot of experience in that. But that's a story for another day. So I mentioned I'm from Toronto. This is a little doodle from my iPad. I was born in the 70s, right around the time the CN Tower was built. I lived within a walk of a very easy view of the CN Tower, so quite centrally. But for those of you who know Toronto, it's actually a nature-rich city. It's built on 3 riverbeds, really, and some of them they sort of filled in, but they'll still run through your basement if you're not careful. And so for me, my memories of growing up as a city mouse were very much about playing in the ravines, the river valleys, lots of different trees. Of course, it was all deforested, so it's reforested, but still a very green existence for me, and that really stamped who I am. I also had the very good fortune of spending a lot of time on a family what we call a cottage up on Manitoulin Island, which is in the northern part of Lake Huron. Again, secondary forest, but as a kid, you're not thinking about, what was here before, or, who did we take this land from? You're thinking, I want to go play in the forest, which I spent a lot of time doing up on Manitoulin as well. This is a sugar maple bush. We produce maple syrup there for fun most years. My sister now lives there and runs a microbrewery in Gourmet, if you're ever in Valley. And I also, this is a little tough to see because it's so faded. I'm not sure if you can see the date in 1984. So I was a teenager, just sketching and watching the world around me, very much influenced by trees. And I was cleaning out my home office the other day and came upon all these sketches I'd forgotten about. So I've been doodling and trying to understand trees and nature really for a long time. And that's really shaped who I am. Adam mentioned that I lived in Brazil. Indeed, I did a Rotary exchange student. Any Rotarians here or exchange students? Yeah, I lived in Brasilia too, in 89, the first, 1989, the first democratic election in Brazil. You might have noticed there was another one recently, and there's been a few. That was an incredible experience, and I actually believe quite concretely that one of our biggest solution spaces in terms of climate is exposure to new and different ideas. Sort of biomimetically, the way nature loves diversity, puts different things like these different minds and different perspectives in the room. Nothing like a student exchange to deliver that to you. And so I was plopped into Brasilia in 1989 as the government transitioned to democracy. Didn't speak a word, literally didn't speak a word of Portuguese. But after a year immersed in a culture where no one spoke English for the most part, now that's shifted, I was fluent, and I had such an enriching experience. For 10 days, my high school class went on a field trip, and there, when you go on a field trip, you can go to the Amazon. So I learned the term, which then was the greenhouse effect, o efeito estufo. I learned about climate change for the first time sitting in an eco school in the Amazon in January 1990. So that was a huge wake-up. In fact, one of my classmates and I from that time, we were so moved by what we heard. We were like, whoa, this is a big deal. We should write a book about this. So we go back to our school in Brasilia, and with our pencils and our workbooks, we're drawing diagrams of the Earth's crust and radiation. And then we got busy and grew up, and he became an engineer, and I did other things. I'm going to skip a few chapters of my life and bring us to New York, where I now reside. And this is me after a running race. I do a fair bit of distance running, which has been another great learning journey where you're sort of moving at human speed and making eye contact with people. I almost never run with something in my ears because I love, first of all, to not get run over by traffic, but also to hear the birds. And if you run in New York City, especially in Central Park, and you're even half awake, you're going to hear the hawks. And when you hear one, and then you get a few miles down the other way, and you hear the other, you realize there's this whole drama playing out between, I think it's still Pale Male. I don't know if any of you are following the hawk romance in New York, but Pale Male kind of runs the show there, and he's had a few girlfriends. So I was just finishing up a race, and couldn't help but notice this. I believe this was one of the cherry trees a couple of springs ago. So this is a very compressed way of saying I've been blessed with living in different parts of the world, but everywhere I went, I feel like nature was sort of trying to tell me stuff. And meanwhile, I, like most people, have sort of had to, and this is another iPad doodle of a tree by 59th Street Bridge, which is right by where I live. But meanwhile, like most people, I've had to, go about my life, pay the bills. This is my version of fireworks, by the way. I took this on July 4th. I find it very weird that we blow things up to celebrate and then bother shorebirds and make smoke and everything. So on July 4th, I went into the conservatory garden in Central Park and shot. I have a whole series of these that those to me are much more bird-friendly and bug-friendly fireworks. But anyway, Lorraine, what do you do for a living? And my mother asks me this because she tries to explain it. So in a nutshell, I'm going to sort of bundle what I do for a living, which is even, I think, a funny framing, right? Like, what do you do for a living? Well, we're alive. So, like, for a living, we really mean how do you earn money? And I'd say right there, that's a problematic human framing. Again, that's probably another conversation for another time. But the easiest way to explain what I do I'm going to start with a broken mental model and explain how my job is to try to understand this mental model, understand it within myself, and then help explain why it's broken with anybody who will pay attention to me or invite me to their meetings and strategy sessions. How many people are familiar with the term the triple bottom line? So it's kind of a known meme. A fellow named John Elkington coined the term approximately 20 years ago. He's currently one of my most active collaborators. Technically, he'd be a client, but I'd say we're just friends, and we like to think at one another, and then sometimes companies bring us together to think at them. So in a way, this is representative of the triple bottom line, the idea that a company or a for-profit entity would put some time into considering its social, environmental, and financial aspects. Sometimes financial is expressed as economic, sometimes it's just described as the business. And of course, I'm speaking English, but this is a global concept, so those words get synonymized in many different ways. I say this is a broken model because what I often see happening with companies is they say, we really need to balance the triple bottom line. We need to balance our social impacts against our financial impacts. Balance, balance. I like that idea, sort of. The problem is that it's completely fakakta. Like, no, you don't need to balance your business against other bottom lines. Your business is nested within society, which is nested within the environment. And there's so many ways I could blow up even this model. Like, actually, that business bubble should be invisibly small in terms of its real scale. And the word environment, in my humble opinion, is a bucket, when in fact it's really like the everything. So to describe it as a circle or a category or a thing from which we should be sort of marking things off is already problematic. But I'm sort of constrained to the English language and the syntax that we exist in. But even that, so that's nice, Lorraine. You take circles and you rearrange them on a slide. So like, well, in a way, going into that, this model doesn't equal that model is a project in and of itself. How to work with an organization, with an executive team, with a sustainability team. So most large companies have sustainability initiatives, goals, strategies, reports. How to work with the folks responsible for that and help them, first of all, just do that, have those goals, understand where they can potentially make or stop making impacts, depending on the context, but then also make that shift from saying, no, you're not trying to balance, you're trying to exist within a thriving, wider context. In some cases, that means understand that wider context. Like, oh, we didn't realize the degree to which these external factors are actually internal factors. Might sound silly, but it's kind of true. But in other cases, like, we realize it, but that's not the way our business was built. We hear this talk of, 2020 has become a real milestone, or in some cases 2030 for companies now, because 2020 is too close. But a lot of companies talking about their 2020 strategies describe that they were built, the structure of their businesses were largely built in 1920. So how do you adapt a business to be thriving in 2020 when it was really built in 1920? So that's sort of the puzzle. I articulate that in a number of ways. And by the way, there are links embedded here. I'm happy to share anything, and a lot of this, all of this is linked on my website. This is a report I co-authored with John Elkington, coiner of the triple bottom line, on behalf of a commission that's been exploring a business that can deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Talk a bit more about that in a moment. So this would just be one example where I'm putting ideas together, case studying examples of businesses that are sort of showing emergent examples of these new business models or adapted business models. And I'm going to give you a lens to test, how would you know that a business model sort of belongs in that future or needs to iterate its way into a new state? I would say the really handy lens is if you see a business expressing the good things it's doing, up until recently, I would say a lot of that information in their sustainability reports, their wonderful programs, their community engagement, there's all different ways we experience business. The vast majority is focused on a sidebar that is spending money to do good things. And I'm not suggesting those are bad ideas. I think companies, it's wonderful that they support charities or they enable some kind of community activity. That's terrific. But they're spending money to do good things, or possibly spending money to do less bad things, reduce harm. The lens I look for, and this touches on the business model aspect of it, is how are they making money? because a business is in the business of making money, and I'm actually comfortable with that. That's how come I got to wear these clothes, I got to get here physically, I got to have the electronic equipment that's around me functioning. That's what business does. It creates and delivers on needs through products and services. In doing that, is it delivering social benefit? Is it restoring ecosystems? Is it sequestering more CO2 than it's emitting? Whatever it is that it's doing, and that's far beyond the energy matrix, right? That's every product and service. That's every category of our industrial society. That's what I mean when I say breaking that mental model, taking that little does not equal sign, and enabling companies to understand that more. So what I say to my mother when she says, but Lorraine, what do you actually do? I say, I put it in two categories. And one category is basically this sort of thinking about these business models, engaging with companies, writing reports, reviewing, providing editorial guidance on some of the reporting, or advisory services. And one of the companies I work most closely with is actually based in Brazil. I'll touch on that in a minute. So that's kind of relatively traditional consulting or advisory work. And I have the pleasure of doing that with John Elkington and a few other partners. That's one of two things. The other thing that I do is more about writing and creating ideas and exploring, I guess you could say, literature, or taking some of the things that I see and experience and trying to make sense of them in a more artistic manner. Just as when I was a kid sketching trees and doodling, that habit has sort of persisted. And that's where this book comes in, and it's a series of 10 nonfiction personal stories about my travels where I noticed a pattern of trees, either still present or more often trees that were no longer there, finally getting through to me. And I lack the English capacity to use words for something that doesn't quite exist. So it's almost like I'm trying to explain over and over a situation that is very difficult to articulate because it's disappeared, or because it's a future state that doesn't exist yet. But I'd say that's sort of my puzzle. And so what I thought I would do for just a few minutes is share a brief excerpt of the story that's in the book where really it was sort of the aha moment. And just before I fully go there, how many of you are familiar with the story of Helen Keller? Okay, I thought in an American audience this would be a pretty safe bet, so this touches on this. And I'll just set this up very briefly. So on a work trip, I had a bit of a nutty journey where I was going to San Francisco and then London, in each place to deliver 2-day workshops on systems thinking. So some of my work I sort of borrow from scholarship in other areas. Systems thinking is a really big one to kind of handle complexity, right? And think about these corporate strategic ideas in a way that manages a non-linear set of ideas. And so I was delivering these systems thinking workshops, San Francisco, London, and then I booked some time off because I've been told that's a good idea. And so I was going to go to Ethiopia for a 3-week journey with no real agenda. It sort of came about very ad hoc, recognizing that's where humanity began, that's where coffee began, so it seemed like a convergence of good things. And also where the greatest long-distance runners are from. And as a long-time distance runner, I was like, well, what's going on there? And so I sort of was following my nose a little bit, as I do. And I booked this trek with no, not even a trek, a trip, with no real plan except for a 5-day time in the Savannah Mountains. However, on my way to San Francisco, I was fighting a cold. In San Francisco, the cold just went haywire. Delivered the workshop, flew overnight to London, delivered the workshop there. By the end of it, I was just running on fumes. And so the day after the workshop, I was incapacitated with a chest and ear infection that was really unpleasant. And I went to the doctor, lovely free healthcare in the UK. Anybody can go, doesn't matter where you're from. And what I was looking for was some way that I could board the flight the next day, the 10-hour flight to Addis Ababa, and then hover there for about a day, and then fly up into the hills in the Savannah Mountains. Addis is a pretty high altitude city. Then I was going to fly up into an even higher altitude. So I was really looking for, a little something I could take, to take the edge off my ear. And the doctor looked in my ear and he literally went, ew. And I was like, that's not good. So he said, you cannot fly. Like, you can not only not fly to a high altitude city and then go traipsing around somewhere where you have no contacts and no information about what you're doing, some vague idea of going into the mountains, you simply can't fly. You can't even fly home. So stay put in the UK. Don't be an idiot, was basically his thesis. So that's the backdrop. Through a friend, I found a place to go stay in Wales for a couple weeks and just cool my heels, convalesce, and when I was ready to go walking. And there's some amazing walking trails there that go through farmers' fields and along some canals. So that's a little bit of background, and I'll just share a couple pages worth of an excerpt from this chapter where the penny really dropped around what trees were trying to tell us. So we're joining in the middle here. The second day, I made a delightful discovery that piqued my interest, realizing that slinking through farmers' fields really isn't my cup of tea, no matter what the locals say. Whereas this compelling curving line on the topographical map labeled Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal might be just the thing. I took a sharp right before the church and headed down between two fields, divided by a tunnel of trees loud with the chirp and rustle of birds. This led to a canal that felt like the country cousin of the Regent's Canal in London. The canals had fascinated me since I first learned about them in London a few years earlier. This neglected transit system, so full of the history of the Industrial Revolution and all it wrought. Here in Wales, hiding in plain sight for anyone to see, was one of the furthest reaching branches of the system, reinventing itself as a picturesque place to walk the dogs, over a century after it served to ease the coal away from the Welsh hillsides. It was thoughts like these that saw me through the transition from labored breathing to brisk striding, pushing a little further along the canal each day. On one such day, I came upon a tree that stopped me in my tracks. It was an enormous conifer, hugging the fence line, but within the allowance of the canal, such that I could just walk right up to it and touch it, peer upwards at its magnificence, and feel dizzy at the sheer volume of living wood. I put my backpack down at the base to convince my future self just how big it was, since I feared I wouldn't believe the memory. The tree struck me as some kind of signal from another time, echoing some of the same refrains as the canal. So on the next day, I set out in the same direction to pass by it again, curious about what it had witnessed in the years of more active use of the canals when they served as a transportation network, certain that this tree was at least as old as modern history, and hence had borne witness to all manner of traffic right before its younger boughs. I pressed on further, only to be called to attention by yet another old gem of a tree. This one was a huge deciduous tree just about to bud a new set of leaves for spring. It had a massive girth that twisted upwards with gnarled and somehow comical gestures, the torque in its bark appearing to spiral in the opposite direction of its boughs, as if it were in motion, in a playful old, you should have seen me in my younger days kind of swivel. I stood, I stared, I took pictures. When I finally carried on, the musings were taking on all kinds of directions, well beyond the time and space taken up by the canals. There were battles won and lost, families made and undone, and episodes of which I surely didn't have the faintest idea. What had this tree witnessed? I also realized that was hardly a new idea. That this is the very nature of experiencing older things. Whether churches or trees or people, our minds turn to the hidden stories that amaze, that put us in that time and place as we make sense of it from our own humble spot. I was just one of many tourists making her way through a well-worn trail and marveling at, well, the marvels. The following day, now feeling even more peppy, I carried on yet further still, first cutting across a huge open pasture with another giant tree in the middle, a few cows grazing quietly nearby, and then cutting through a more densely wooded patch between a private estate and a churchyard, to get to another branch of the canal, passing through a gnarled and delightful grove of dozens of trees that seemed to be dancing to a similar song as their friend down the way. All the while being struck dumb by the age and mightiness of these old trees. And then it happened. It wasn't a particularly unusual tree that revealed the truth to me in its most miraculous way. In fact, this next tree was like several others that I had seen earlier that day, standing tall and thick and stately in the corner of their fields, or maybe in the middle, or even hanging tough in a hedgerow. In many ways, this one was just like those others. But that was just it. The others. This one. Surely there were more. there had been more. And I felt a torrent of awareness, reminiscent of the scene in the movie The Miracle Worker, about Helen Keller, the deaf-blind author and activist, during which we see the young girl's teacher finally getting through to her. The teacher's relentless sequence of pounding into Helen's hands, spelling water, W-A-T-E-R, in sign language, and this wet, cold, splashing stuff is in fact water. Helen senses, not sees, not hears, not says, but senses, based on the information her teacher has so desperately been trying to impress upon her, that this is water, and then yes, this is grass, and this is a nose, and this is a person and a chair, and everything else that is in Helen's world that can now be known and explored with the senses opened to understanding. Except I was the blind, deaf, and dumb one, not sensing, not understanding what trees have been quietly hammering into me since I could see them filtering the sunlight above my infant eyes. What did they finally get through to me? That this one beauty standing alone in a field began life as part of an extensive, maybe even densely populated community of trees, that they had been all around where I was standing, some as big or even bigger than the one I could see right now, and many in between in that size. That they were everywhere before they were reduced to ships' hulls, houses, firewood, or burnt-out nuisance stumps in the way of farmers sowing their crops. These picturesque fields were no more than very old clear-cuts. While we shudder in righteous horror and conjure 1980 songs about the slashing and burning of the Amazon rainforest, as we pressure food companies who source their tons of palm oil from orangutan habitat in Indonesia and inject it into everything from peanut butter to pizza, as we slap the corporate wrists, also known as their websites and Twitter feeds, of toilet paper brands sourcing tree fiber from eastern Canada without certification, we meanwhile send one another postcards of pre-slaughtered meat products grazing in an old clear-cut in Wales. We can't see the forest for the cute sheep and the dizzying fresh air that we're intermittently permitting ourselves to breathe as we collect but a fragment of the stories being shared all around us. Realities bouncing off our senses like so many sign language letters presented to the biologically illiterate. When I pointed out this dichotomy to one friend back in London afterwards, he was quick to retort, "Oh great, now you've ruined Wales." As if I was the one who cut the trees. As if the International Panel on Climate Change was the one sending all the carbon from the trees and soil into the air. The trees, meanwhile, are busy being trees. Trees which we barely register beyond their aesthetic value in places such as Wales, and so we completely miss the main melody, much less the many harmonious chords available for anyone to hear. So much information is right there for us to take in if only we can tune into the frequency of those things whose disappearance shaped our reality. Listening for the aftershocks, which are indeed there and only getting louder. There may be nothing intrinsically wrong with sheep grazing in a field, but there is something not quite right about interpreting that as a desirable scene of beauty while ignoring what made it possible. Meanwhile, sharing viral videos of activist campaigners that decry the same process playing out a few centuries later for pursuits no more or less reasonable than coal for power or sheep for meat and wool, pursuits such as palm oil and pizza and peanut butter. Meanwhile, it is inevitable that treed land will be cleared for human management of some sort, that the sheep will be shorn and eventually slaughtered, that palm plantations will be cultivated for our processing purposes, that industry will grind forth, seeking repeatable, efficient means of feeding itself and us humans too. Or maybe it's not inevitable. I retain the right to imagine that there is another way, one where we don't accidentally perceive beauty, where there is great loss, where we reach beyond what industry has dealt us and, instead of seeing playgrounds to visit for our pleasure before returning to our jobs that rest upon this scaffolding of accidental unawareness, we ask how our passing through any space at any time can nurture rich and teeming life once more, and what that has to do with those precariously perched regular jobs. And we will hear the answer with renewed sense of literacy about life, not as a hashtag to click or not. I cannot unhear what that centuries-old tree made so clear to me that day in Wales, that there were legions more like it, and we removed them. just as we are doing in more newly developing countries today. My eyes may have seen a tall and solitary feature of a field, but my senses, including my ears, now wide open, heard one tree among many trees, who have been yielding to us while keeping us alive, drumming out a steady story, coded in a language as easy as the alphabet, written into the spaces left behind. Thank you. I do have a little bit more. Thank you. So a few more pennies piled onto my head, and I'll share quickly the pummeling of treasure from nature, right? Which is what it is. And I did ultimately make it to Ethiopia. So Wales was wonderful. I went back to my job, and but was determined to get there. And I did go to the Savannah Mountains. Has anybody been? It's magic. It's incredible. This is one of many vistas. However, here's another. It's like the Grand Canyon, literally in scope and scale. However, as I walked through Ethiopia, now a little bit more awake thanks to Wales, I noticed that even incredible vistas like this are actually forms of deforestation. This is an overgrazed plain. And this particular spot, right around the corner from where that rainbow shot was taken, my guide, Leach, who has since become a very good friend, he remembered. I said, when did these trees go? Is this like hundreds of years ago kind of thing? Because humanity began here a long time ago. He said, no, I remember when this was a forest. It looked like this. This is a little further outside of Savannah Mountains National Park. And so this deforestation is playing out. It's overgrazing, and it's the need for wood, for cook stoves, which is a real pressure point in Ethiopia. So I went back. I went twice, because the story is just floating off the land. If you listen, we're just flooding my senses. And this is deeper into that heather forest. They're called heathers, which are, of course, slightly different. I just want you to see the range. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a scientist. But the range of different life forms clinging to all these different pieces of the forest were just phenomenal. It's actually a very low forest. You can almost touch the canopy, but it's quite magical. And this was one of the few very large trees still within the park. That's me before I molted. But one of the things that really struck me, and another one of the stories in the book is called Dirty Weather. Coming out of the park of the Savannah Mountains on my last trip, this is a truck with lumber. You see how old those trees are? Like, not old at all, about 3 years. It's all eucalyptus, invasive. By the way, that's a beehive, that cluster in the woods. That's how they make honey using these very interesting beehives, very different format. That's a woman sitting on top of the truck. You'll notice that there's a kind of a tinge to the air. There's no filter on this. It looks, you kind of want to rub your eyes. I did too, because all the soil was up in the air. And everyone commented on the haze. I was on my way to the airport, which was totally grounded due to weather. But this is not weather. This is the soil up in the air, right? You could taste it. You could feel it. And this was yet another round of the trees saying, yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo, we're trying to tell you something. Brazil, this is in São Paulo in the center. That is one of the only remaining more than a century-old trees of the Mata Atlântica, which is the Atlantic forest, the native biome of the São Paulo region. Everybody knows about the Amazon. Few know about the Mata Atlântica, which is almost as big, or the Cerrado, another biome. Brazil is enormous, rich with biodiversity. And there's a man who is almost single-handedly replanting the Mata Atlântica in Brazil, an amazing man named Ricardo Cardim, and he introduced me to the city's veterans, he calls them, any of the trees that are over 100 years old. This is right in the center. I go back because I do work with a pulp and paper company named Fibria. I'm on their sustainability advisory board. And this is where, so just to ground it in, how am I spending those pennies? This is one of the leading companies. You can see they're super transparent. You can see so much information about what they're doing online, their social and environmental practices. Truly leaders. I openly said yes, because when the chairman of the board asked me to join their advisory board, I was really honest. I was like, can I be weird? Like, can I be me? Because that's what I'd like to do. And he was like, that's why we're hiring you. So I pushed them to think about biomimicry. I pushed them to think about regenerative agriculture, about the regenerative economy of the future, which is one I'd like to live in. That's what I do with them. When you go to one of their plantations, you see that on the one hand, they're managing soil and people and all the kinds of things in the best possible corporate way. And yet I was standing in this particular plantation to learn about the evolved practices they have around managing leaf-cutting ants, which, if you're a forest products company, what you really want is the product of photosynthesis, also known as wood pulp. That's how you earn money. If you're a leaf-cutting ant, you want the leaves, which photosynthesize and make that pulp. So they're kind of at odds with one another, and the best practice up until recently was to do some pretty nasty things with toxins throughout the forest to keep the leaf-cutting ants at bay. The evolved practice is to put a very targeted amount of an extremely lethal to ants toxin on that pheromone trail that we saw yesterday, which was really neat. And the ant drops its leaf load and picks up that bait, and if all goes well for the company, not so much for the ant colony, the food goes in, the queen partakes in it, she dies, the colony fails, the pulp company wins. From an environmental perspective, that's better than how it was being done, and it's considered world leading and very innovative and all that good stuff. So I was one of the stakeholders there to look at, take that in. From the perspective of life on Earth, we've got a ways to evolve to get beyond this kind of pulp company duking it out with ants. So again, I explore that a little bit further in the book. And in my beautiful Northern Ontario, where I still love to spend time, I realized, having worked as a tree planter during my university summers to pay for school, that really what a tree planter is a day laborer putting a tree in the ground every 6 feet for about 10 cents a tree for industry. So again, for the pulp and paper industry. And you spend your days in clear cuts. And I've realized since growing up and spending time in Northern Ontario, just how much of the North is actually replant, either clear cut or industrial forest. There's lots more I can say. I have other things I could talk about the industrial work I can do. I'm going to quickly touch on the sort of epilogue of the book, and then just one final point about the corporate work, so you'll see me skip through a bunch of slides. The epilogue looks at the last wood carrier. This is a wood carrier walking down the mountain behind Addis Ababa, Mount Toto, like hundreds of other women do every day. Some of them walk up to 20 miles now to get wood, bundle it, and she is literally, you can barely tell in this photo, she is literally bent at a right angle and will walk. I'm a marathon runner, so I have enormous respect for the distance she does, which is about a marathon, just to get wood to burn in her cook stove. There will be a last wood carrier, and the epilogue is called The Last Wood Carrier. There will be a last one because we will either have no more wood to gather, or we will have innovated our way out of this. I prefer that latter option. So that's Where the Trees, the book. Stay tuned. Hopefully it's going to come out. I'm going to just quickly go. Let's just imagine for a moment that's the Sustainable Development Goals that we're imagining applying. And I'm just going to, in the interest of your time, happy to talk about this more, just end on a moment of imagination. So what I basically do for the within the corporate conversations that I have, applying hopefully some useful tools, is I help people recognize that, we know that that's an acorn. We just instinctively know because if we're from around here, we've seen something like this before. We know that an acorn leads to an oak. And nature's been like, hey, check this out, right? You give this guy the right conditions and you get something like this. It's an exponential magnification of the potential of that one seed. And its instructions are built in. I mean, it's just a magnificent tool. And if we look at life's principles, which the folks in the biomimicry field of scholarship have done an incredible job of organizing, we can look at those life principles within a corporation. We can apply it to corporate strategy, to industrial design, to organizational development. We can put it in all kinds of places. We can take the principles of systems thinking, of cooperation, collaboration, and help companies recognize that while it's really easy to bash them, it's a lot more fun and I think high potential in the positive future we want to live in to enable them to imagine where they are currently looking at some acorns and have the potential to deliver the equivalent of oak trees across their value chains within their communities and beyond as a matter of what they do for a living. That's essentially how I keep busy while hopefully trying to get that book out into the real world one of these days. I thank you enormously for your attention. There's ways to keep in touch, and really appreciate any feedback or ideas you have as I leap off the stage here. Thank you very much. Is it a break now? Should I say anything?
Oh, So with our new time scale, it's now